Good afternoon. Welcome to the Pupil Personnel Services Technical Assistance webinar. We are glad to be here to present information on the new PPS preconditions, standards, and performance expectations that were adopted by the Commission in April of 2019 and that all PPS programs will implement by the summer and fall of 2021. My name is Karen Sacramento, and I am a consultant at the CTC working with PPS programs. Also presenting today with me are Terry Clark, our Administrator of the Professional Services Division, Cheryl Hickey, the Administrator of Accreditation at the Commission, and Roxanne Purdue, Consultant working with PPS programs. And we also have program specialists with us who were a part of the PPS Standards work group, and they are Brent Duncan, who will share information on the PPS School Psychology Standards and Performance Expectations, Steve Hayden, who will share information on the PPS School Social Work Standards and Performance Expectations, and Shira Minton, who will be sharing information on the PPS School Counseling Standards and Performance Expectations. So moving to our agenda, on the next slide, we will be covering the following areas over our time together. We're going to take a broad look at some of the key aspects and the overall organization of the PPS Program Preconditions, Standards, and Performance Expectations, or PEs. And then we're going to move into more of an in-depth look at some of those specialty areas and have our content experts go over the standards and specific PEs considerations that are unique to the new standards. And then we're going to share information on the PPS regulatory process. That's our behind-the-scenes necessary work that we'll be doing over the next year and a half. We'll be looking at the transition for programs, the PPS transition timeline, and the plan to support programs as they move into the new standards. And then we will wrap up with looking at what is to come over the next year and a half with specific PPS technical assistance. Throughout our Zoom time together, the Zoom link chat feature will allow us to welcome participants submitting questions, and we encourage you and welcome you to do that throughout the presentation. Terry is monitoring that, and we will share the question and the answer with all as they come in. So moving ahead and looking at the next slide, this is the first topic area in the standards, and it's the common principles, values, and goals of all pupil personnel services preparation programs. And these statements identify those essential attributes that all Commission-approved PPS programs must incorporate to prepare candidates. These statements are referenced in each of the specialty area program standard 1 areas, and they apply to all PPS credential candidates. And they really guide each program in how to meet the program standards and performance expectations, and as such, should be visible throughout the program design, the fieldwork, and be known by faculty and candidates. So they really are the core of each of the standards. In them, there's an emphasis on how PPS credential programs ensure that candidates develop the knowledge, skills, and personal and professional dispositions to help maximize their developmental potential and support their preparation, and then how PPS credential programs support candidates' understandings of core components that are necessary as PPS practitioners. Also in this is how PPS programs support a multidisciplinary PPS team approach to address the very pressing issues in California schools today. As we move on to the next slide, we are looking at the PPS program preconditions. And each of the 3 PPS standards documents and standards and performance expectation documents also contain PPS program preconditions. And these preconditions are those baseline requirements that must be met in order to operate as a CTC accredited program sponsor. Some preconditions are based on state laws, and other preconditions are established by commission policy. For PPS, there are 3 preconditions, and they are the same for school counseling, school social work, and school psychology, except for precondition 2, which contains specific program curriculum requirements. So I'm going to move to the next slide and talk about the specific PPS program preconditions. The first precondition states that a candidate must hold a minimum of a bachelor's degree. This is directly from Education Code. So there's that requirement.
And let me interject here to point out, you will notice that it no longer says in a field other than education. The commission did sponsor a bill last year, and it removed that prohibition both from the PPS programs and from the special education programs. So if you have a candidate who comes in and wants to enroll in your program and their college degree is in education, you now can accept them.
Thank you. Important point. Number 2 then focuses on that program curriculum, precondition number 2. This precondition is currently in Title V regulations, and it is specific to each PPS specialization area. So for the school counselor specialization, that program curriculum is a minimum of 48 semester units or 72 quarter units or 720 classroom hours of postgrad study. For school psychologist, the curriculum is a minimum of 60 semester units or 90 quarter units or 900 classroom hours of postgrad study. And then for the school social work specialization, the curriculum must be equivalent to a minimum of 45 semester units or 67.5 quarter units or 675 classroom hours of postgrad study. So again, that is specific to each program, and so that precondition looks different in each document. And then the third precondition is the same across all PPS areas, and that is for intern programs, specifically the intern option. And that states that an entity that operates an approved program of preparation for PPS with an intern option has certain requirements. They need to make sure that a candidate admitted into the intern option has completed sufficient coursework prior to the internship so that the candidate is ready for supervised practice in the school, and that the intern candidate be supervised and supported by both the employer and the commission-approved program. So now I'm going to turn it over to Terry Clark to cover some information on the PPS program standards and performance expectations.
So we're quite excited about this change, and we hope you will be too. The Commission standards used to intermingle the expectations for what a program must offer and what a candidate must know and be able to do by the end of the program. Your programs used to have those 16 generic standards that all programs shared, and then some number of additional standards, topping out at those 32 standards, which was the largest set of program standards. Back in about 2015-16, we got to be a little more sophisticated. Program standards now define what a program must provide to each candidate. And in the program standards, there's always a standard that says, the candidates at the end of the program must know these things and be able to do these things. And the things are defined as the performance expectations. We started this in the teaching world. There are teaching performance expectations. It also exists in the administrator preparation world with administrator performance expectations. It exists in the early childhood world and now in the pupil personnel services world. So these performance expectations, they really define the knowledge and skill that a candidate has and that they have to be able to demonstrate at the end of the program prior to being recommended for a credential. So the next slide. The program standards now is defined for you, and there are only 5. 5 is such a nice smaller number. It's a statement of what the program must provide to all candidates. They are reviewed during program review and during the accreditation site visit, and we will be talking about them in more depth later in the webinar. But I kind of wanted just to point out there is definitely a program standard, and it has to do with the program standard 2 that we're going to talk about, that is going to make sure that those performance expectations are not ignored. So on the next slide, we actually list the 5 standards. And these are really very consistent across the 3 specialty areas, although within each of these standards in each of the 3 areas, it's very individualized. So there's always a program design and rationale for all 3 areas. And then standard 2. This standard is actually standard 2 for preliminary teacher preparation. It's standard 2 for PPS now. It says you must prepare your candidates to meet the performance expectations. You must actually monitor them and support them in doing that by program standard 3. They have to have some clinical practice. It means they have to practice what they're learning, the theoretical part of what they're learning. And then program standard 5 in all 3 of these areas are you have to make sure you've assessed candidate competence. Program Standard 4 is specialized within each of the 3 areas. Each of the three sets of Program Standards 4 has at least 2 of these sub-ideas. The Practica Fieldwork definition, the Internship or Culminating Field Experience definition, the qualifications and training of the site supervisors, and then the topic of child welfare and attendance. Child welfare and attendance is now being dealt with a little bit differently. So if we could go to slide 10. All pupil personnel services programs will be eligible to give a child welfare and attendance authorization. It is still an additional authorization, and it's only given to the candidates who meet the requirements. And the requirement has no additional theoretical content because the content for the child welfare and attendance has actually been embedded in the performance expectations for all 3 of the PPS areas. What a candidate has to do is they have to have completed 150 hours of clinical practice as described in Program Standard 4 for child welfare and attendance. If your candidate has done those 150 hours, then when you recommend them for their full PPS credential, whether it's psychology, school social work, or school counseling, you also will recommend them for the child welfare and attendance authorization. And I know that the specific specialists are going to talk about it a little bit more as we go further into the presentation. Slide 11 is more the performance expectations. So these are really clear statements of what a candidate must know and be able to do when they're recommended for their credential. Programs must assess these during the program and at the end. Another thing is the design team that worked on this really tried to align this to the national standards for the National Professional Association so that you actually have a program that's very aligned if you elect to go for national accreditation also. There's all assessment in these programs remains local at this time, although the design team that worked together did talk about the idea of in the future, maybe it would be appropriate to have a performance assessment. That is down the road. There's nothing now on that. It is every program must locally assess all the performance expectations. Moving to slide 12 means I'm going to turn it to Brent for our school psychology area.
Great. Thank you very much, Terry. And I'm really going to try to follow the framework that the 2 of you have laid out and just talk about some of the specific changes that we made in each of these 3 areas. I want to start by saying that the small group that worked on these standards were all school psychologists. 4 of us were primarily trainers. 5 were primarily practitioners. But of the, is that on? Yeah. Oh, but of the 5 practitioners who joined us, 3 of them were also part-time trainers, so worked within programs. One of the very first things, in fact, let's do the next slide then. One of the very first things that we talked about in the first meeting was these 16 generic and 11 specialty standards that Terry referenced in the old credential. And we asked ourselves, do we want to continue this structure? And each of the groups did this separately. The very first unanimous thing that we decided is we've got to get rid of this. We've got to change this structure. Those of you who've written to these standards know that the problems are they're redundant. There's consultation, for example, in both sets of standards. And then as Terry mentioned, there's program expectations and candidate expectations that are mixed. And so our very first idea was that we need to move to this. So the idea of 5 program standards and 10 candidate performance expectations, I think you're going to like a lot. So let's move to the next slide then. So Standard 1 is pretty much what we have in Standard 1 existing. This is where you start with the generic PPS statement and move into what your program philosophy is. We had most of our work on the credential was within group. So school psychologists working together, school counselors, school social workers. But we certainly spent enough time cross group to know that there's lots that we share. School psychologists, school counselors, and school psychologists do work in very similar areas. So that overall statement really is an attempt to say, what is it that someone with any of these credentials would have? But we no longer have the 11 generic standards that everyone has to meet. So Standard 1 you should be very familiar with. Standard 2 and 3 are very different. Unless you've been writing to national standards already. If you've been writing to either APA standards or NASP standards, Standard 2 and 3 will be very familiar. Standard 2 really is where you lay out what is the coursework and the clinical practice that will meet all of these performance expectations. So here's where you really outline, here are the classes, here's the practicum experience, here's how our internship is organized, here's the faculty and the qualified faculty that teach these expectations. So Standard 1 is your program philosophy. Standard 2 really allows you to describe your program. And then Standard 3 is specific to faculty and supervisor requirements, and then also articulating how are you asking students to meet these standards. So there's an assessment piece that's built into this. How are you going to assess each of those candidate expectations? And I know that this was true in the old standard as well, but just to reiterate, all of the program expectations must be practiced. So as you define what your practicum is, if you have a standalone practicum, then you're going to need to describe how those practica hours are spent in each of the performance expectations. If you have practica that goes along with each class, how are you going to do that? Okay, so next slide. So Standard 4 then is the clinical practice, and there are 2 parts of this. 4A has to do with practica, and 4B has to do with the internship. The main change for 4A is the simplification of the hourly requirements. The hours are the same, but you no longer have to document so many hours at each level of school. It used to be so much elementary, so much middle school, so much high school. Now it's a minimum of 300 hours in P12 settings, and you can do a maximum of 150 hours in clinic or community settings. And again, to reiterate, their practica must include all areas of the performance expectations. Okay, so next slide. So 4B, it looks like there's a major change, and there's been some confusion around this, and I think I might be responsible even for some of the confusion. So I'm going to use this to attempt to clarify, and if I don't get it right, you can fix it after I'm done here. But if you remember, in the old standard, Standard 25 had to do with practica, Standard 26 was the internship. And within Standard 26, there was a detailed description of the intern credential and how you earn the intern credential. And that's no longer present. So the only thing that's referenced in 4B is an intern option or the final culminating experience. The intern credential, as we just talked about, is precondition 3, and it's germane to all 3 disciplines, and it has a separate ed code authorization, but it's no longer described within the standard itself. Okay, next slide. So in terms of the hourly requirement, the 1,200 hours is still the same. Again, 1,000 hours must be in a P12 setting, and as we've talked previously, candidates wishing to earn the child welfare and attendance authorization have to do 150 hours of field experience, and that would be during your internship or your culminating experience. Just to give one extra detail from Terry's description of how we did this, there was a separate group of trainers who were focusing on child welfare and attendance. And toward the end of the work, when we'd all developed our standards, they came around and met with each of the three groups and said, here are the standards for child welfare and attendance. Here's the content that must be covered. And we went through our program expectations, and they verified that everything that was in the CWA credential is built into each of the three specializations. So there's no extra content. There's no special course. Certainly, if you were offering that authorization, you'd want to make sure in your legal and ethical course that you cover the laws regarding child attendance. But the only thing specific to earn the credential is that documentation of the 150 field hours in those areas. Okay, last, this is a repeat, but I think it's really important from precondition 3. So programs offering an intern option shall require each candidate to have completed sufficient coursework so that the candidate is ready for supervised practice in the field. That's, again, right out of precondition 3. So I happen to feel very strongly that school psychology interns should be paid. I'm not at all in favor of unpaid internships. If there's for some reason that a program has to offer an unpaid internship, so be it. But I really believe personally that all programs ought to be able to offer candidates the option of earning a credential so that they can be paid. So that what this precondition says is you'll need to there's no separate curriculum that you're going to define for your internship. You're simply going to articulate where the internship comes in your training model and to make sure that the essential coursework has all been covered prior to the internship beginning. Okay, next slide. So the performance expectations again. So 5 standards that programs have to meet, 10 performance expectations that candidates have to meet. And I'm sure that most of you who are school psychology trainers are going to know why we have 10 performance expectations, and that is because they've been carefully aligned with the practice domain in the NASP practice model and the NASP training standards. Other than eliminating this 2-tiered structure, the other thing that we all felt strongly about was the need to align this much more carefully with NASP. So the performance expectations, from my perspective, represent a significant updating of professional practices in all areas related to the practice of school psychology. So as we wrote the performance expectations, we sat down with the NASP standards. We did have access to documents that reflect changes that are coming in the 2020 NASP standards. We also looked at the current California standards, and then each of the trainers that was on the group brought in the material that they were using in each of these content areas. So I think you'll find when you look at them that the performance expectations align nicely with the NASP standards and reflect an updating of all of the skills that school psychologists need. Okay, next slide. So the performance, this to me is a major change. If you remember, the old credential had what were called questions to consider. And those questions to consider were things that program assessors would do to come in as they look at your program to say, here are things that you might look for in your program. So there's no longer the questions to consider. Instead, for each of those performance expectations, there's 3 to 6 elements that define the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities that candidates have to demonstrate. Next slide. So the performance expectations, again, knowledge, skills, and abilities. What you're going to see the first time you sit down to look at these is that it's much more action-oriented. Instead of describing what you're teaching, it's talking about what are the skills abilities and knowledge that you expect your candidates to have. So verbs like understand, interpret, select, evaluate, implement. How is it that you are training your candidates to do each of those things? So you'll look for action verbs, overriding themes, reflect almost all of the areas reflect an increased emphasis on cultural and linguistic differences and implications of social justice for the work of school psychologists. We're really asking in the training for candidates to be able to work with all children in all settings and be able to deal with any of the realities that children might bring to school with them. Okay, I'll turn it over to my school counseling colleague.
So Shira, you're on now.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes. Okay. So the major areas of change, I was part of the school counseling panel. There were 9 of us, I believe. We had a nice mix of both trainers and also practicing school counselors currently. I believe everyone on the panel at some point in time was a school counselor. And we also had a couple of administrators, which brought an interesting dynamic to the panel. And we were fortunate enough to have 2 of the individuals who worked on the previously adopted standards in 2000. So it was nice to have a historical context. We could really dig into why some of the standards have been included, why others have been left off. And we've arrived at a nice, well-rounded set of standards and performance expectations that I'll walk you through. So looking at the major areas of change, course structural, as Brent just mentioned, our program standards and then performance expectations. So if we can move to the next slide. The first huge change for us was the reduction from 32 standards, 16 generic and 16 specialty standards to 5 program standards and 9 performance expectations. So those of us who've written to our previous 32 standards, I think we are all breathing a little easier thinking about accreditation upcoming. And so just as a reminder, the standards or the program standards really detail what the program must provide, and they're more broad and encompassing. And then our performance expectations are what the candidates must demonstrate, and ultimately the programs must assess for. So let's start with program standards 1 and 2. If we can go on to the next slide. Standard 1 for us is program design and rationale, yes, but we have also included collaboration, communication, and partnership. This is a revision of the previous standard 1 from the 2000 standards. And we've included collaboration, communication, and partnerships because we really want there to be strong relationships that exist between the training programs or the preparation programs and the schools where our students will engage in their field work and also in their practicum experience. So we've also included in that standard information related to qualified faculty, and we left that somewhat broad because we did not want to so structure and limit programs from identifying who they believe to be qualified faculty. And so you'll see in language when you sit down to review the program standards, specifically program standard 1. Program standard 2 focuses on, of course, preparing the candidates to master the SCPEs. And this is really focused on ensuring opportunities for candidates to learn, apply, and reflect on the performance expectations. It's also important to note for program standard 2 and the PEs in general, we really pulled from some of the generic standards because much of that information was very useful and still reflective of what school counselors are doing today. I understand there might be some issue with my sound, and I hope it has resolved. Next slide, standard 3, where we are monitoring, supporting, and assessing candidate progress towards meeting, of course, the credential requirements and the performance expectations. And so how are we as programs monitoring and supporting candidates, but we are also focusing on assessing their personal and academic growth. So think dispositions, think of how we are surveying our students, collecting feedback, really understanding their engagement in the programs. Standard 4, which is our clinical practice standard. It looks like my video has been stopped.
I turned off the video, Shira, just because your audio is lagging, but go ahead and continue presenting, please.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure if my audio went as well. That's why I stopped. Okay, so standard 4, which is practica, there's a requirement, of course, that remains for 100 hours of practicum experience. That experience should be completed prior to field work and field experience in general. And that's not, the 100 hours is staying the same, but the recommendation for it to occur prior to field work, we wanted to make sure that was included. And if we move to the next slide of for standard 4, which is clinical practice, we see the significant change in fieldwork. We have increased our fieldwork requirement from, 600 hours to 800 hours of experience. So 600 hours must be completed in a public school setting with pre-K through 12 pupils. 200 hours of the 800 can be completed in other areas related to schools and or counseling. So the required 150 hours of CWA, for example, can be counted toward this 200 hours of non-PPS or non-school counseling related duties. There are required activities now that candidates must participate in during field work. And you can see the newly adopted standard, specifically Program Standard 4, which covers field work and those changed activities that candidates are responsible for. We did keep the 150 hours requirement for work with students of diverse backgrounds. However, we expanded the idea of what a diverse background encompasses. On the panel and in public comments, we received information about students or candidates regularly pulling the same students because they were of a different cultural background to engage and complete the 150 hours requirement. And so we really talked about what does diversity mean as a topic and what does that include? And so as you review the standards and the program expectations or performance expectations, you will see a more inclusive and expansive definition around what is meant by the term students of diverse backgrounds. Candidates must also create an individualized self-care plan. During our discussion as a panel, we talked about things like compassion fatigue. We talked about burnout with the very high caseloads that many school counselors experience on a regular basis. And so we really believe that inputting into the program training requirements, some focus on self-care and a real understanding of how to create a plan, but also engage in that plan was something that could be transferred and kept and revised and so forth. But once it's started in the training program, it's more likely that it will continue once they enter the professional world as school counselors. And so that's a shift, but one we believe was very relevant and necessary. Next,
so Shira, if I could interject here, I've got a couple questions while you're on this topic of the field experience, the clinical practice. Okay. So from Michelle, can any of the 200 hours of clinical practice for school counseling include community college work under a master's degree supervisor?
Yes, we did not limit per se supervisors. We did believe and want to continue the master's degree requirement. And so community college work, academic counseling in a community college, disability resources, transfer center work were all things that we discussed as a panel. We did not specifically identify X, Y, and Z only because we did not want to limit programs. And so those types of decisions would, of course, be up to the program. But the 200 hours is related to schools or counseling. So it can be external counseling in a community agency, a college counseling setting, and the like.
And then a second question, DMG is asking, is there a self-care plan template that you want us all to use? And can the practica include individual counseling in the department's training clinic?
Good questions. Also, I think at the discretion of the program, because we as a panel, again, we didn't want to be so specific that it would be at the detriment of the program. Like, you have to use this particular self-care plan. This is the only one that will work. There are so many resources available around self-care and creating individualized plans that can be at the discretion of the program. And I would say also the same, it is regarding the individual counseling in the department's training clinic. And so if I'm understanding this question correctly, this is the person providing the service, or are we talking about the candidate seeking service? So
the person providing the service.
Yes. And so if the program deems that that's an appropriate setting, and the candidates are meeting what's included in the standards, I believe that would be okay. But of course, I think this is a commission specific question because they're the ones who are marking us as met or unmet. Okay, and so candidates must complete 100 hours in social, emotional, college, career, and academic counseling specifically. This is a very large shift from us. I'm so sorry. There's a question related to this particular slide. I believe this will be added this information I'm adding about fieldwork, this slide will be added when this presentation is uploaded for the public. So like I was saying, candidates must complete 100 hours of the 600 required hours in school settings in social, emotional, college, career, and academic counseling. And so as I mentioned, this is a huge shift from us because as a panel, we talked through and also got public comments about counselors graduating their preparation programs and really only having done one type of counseling. Maybe it was all social emotional, or it was all focused around college and career readiness. And so when they get into the field, they are less prepared to help students across the three broad domains that all school counselors are responsible for. And so this shift, we believe, will be of benefit and also aligned with the performance expectations. So to discuss continuous standard for clinical practice, the qualifications, training, and responsibilities of site supervisors, many of those elements, if we can go back to the previous slide, many of those elements remain the same. However, there are two specific changes that we wanted folks to be aware of. Supervisors must now receive training and models of supervision in the performance expectations and program fieldwork requirements. And it is the program's responsibility to provide that continuing education. Next, candidates must meet with the supervisor for 1 hour of individual supervision or 1.5 hours of group supervision each week. And there's specific information included related to how many individuals constitute a group if it's going to be the 1.5 hours. But that is a shift from us because in the previous standards, it was optional, it was strongly suggested, but now it is required. If we can move to the next slide. Also under clinical practice, the CWA, and this is how we've broken up the 150 hours of field experience that is required for this added authorization, a minimum of 90 hours in a school setting in direct contact with pupils is required, as well as a minimum of 30 hours that should include interdisciplinary experiences in a setting that is outside of the field of education. So this could be law enforcement, juvenile justice, child health and welfare, mental health, social services, child protective services, and so forth. And the last 30 hours are at the discretion of the university supervisor. But of course, we encourage feedback from the candidate in deciding on what the remaining 30 hours might look like. Next slide. We get into the performance expectations, and just as a reminder, we have 9 now as a specialization. And so each PE, of course, has specific elements, knowledge, skills, and abilities that must be assessed for by the program, and that we strongly believe candidates should be able to demonstrate. And of course, the program will determine if that is through assignments. There are some things that must be demonstrated through field experience and so forth. But all of the elements have specific directive word or directive wording that's included. So that's such as developing and apply. So develop and apply an individualized self-care plan, or examine the state and federal guidelines around fill in the blank, or articulate or demonstrate. And so we have very clearly identified in the performance expectations how the program would need to assess and things to consider. So what is the knowledge that the skill or the ability that the candidate has to show mastery of? There is now a PE specific to each of the domains of school counseling. Those are the 3 broad domains of academic, social, emotional, and college and career readiness. And as I mentioned previously, those are really aligned with fieldwork.
So Shira, I have another question here. Can you define and describe training models of supervision? What does it look like?
So, for example, Bernard's model of supervision, the discrimination model, the developmental model of supervision, those are examples. And so the program will be required to show that they are providing this training. The training can look like, it could be an online training. These are things we talked about as a panel. It could be an online training that programs are requiring the site supervisors to participate in, some type of online module. It could be an on ground where supervisors have to come to the university for training, or the faculty may be going out to schools and holding seminars or in-service training for supervisors around supervision. Really, we just wanted to ensure that our supervisors were well informed, not just on the model of supervision, but also on the performance expectations, and also on what their students or their candidates will need to engage in, so that the program can document that they are meeting the standards during their reviews and such. And so for some districts, we discussed how candidates, connect with someone at the district level, and then that person finds them a supervisor. And there's not necessarily a lot of dialogue around, oh, have you supervised before? What are the qualifications? Or have you had ongoing training or continuing education? So this is a way for us to try and remedy some of those areas, and also to consider that folks who have gone through their programs, who are school counselors currently, they may look at the standards, but they are not necessary. They didn't come from a program that was engaged in these standards. So that's why we believed there was a need for the ongoing supervision and training. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. So the new school counseling PEs include the elements that you will see when you sit down to review the performance expectations. And as I mentioned previously, some of the previous generic standards from the 2000 standards are included. And so you will see aspects of some of that information. They are aligned with the national standards that include KCREP and ASCA, and they really do reflect a significant updating of our professional practices really in all areas of the 3 broad domains that are connected to the outcomes of our students. And the next slide. The PEs really enhance focus on mental health issues and the impact to students across each of the domains. There is comprehensive prevention and intervention services around crisis and trauma, something that was not necessarily a focus for school counselors in the past, but is very real and clearly occurring on campuses today. So there needs to be preparation around prevention and intervention services. There is enhanced focus on social justice, equity, and access in schools and the role of the school counselor. And that is something that was continued. I will say it's just more embedded throughout the social justice, equity, and access in schools. There is a need for continuing education around crisis, trauma, and mental health services that is now required in the performance expectations, and a focus on multi-tiered systems of support and social emotional learning. So in a nutshell, you can see just by these few slides, there are some significant changes for us in the profession of school counseling, but we do strongly believe that these changes are more reflective of what counselors are having to deal with today in the services that they're providing to students who are affected by many of these issues, crisis, trauma, mental health issues and crises. So we believe that this is a positive shift for the profession.
Thank you, Shira. Now we'll move to Steve Hayden.
Hello, everyone. You can hear me okay? Okay, great. So I'm Steve Hayden, and I had the privilege and honor of working on the school social work standards with colleagues of mine that were either current or retired school social workers or current and or retired faculty from 4 different institutions. Similar to my colleagues before me, I will walk you through some structural changes, program standard changes, and some changes and highlights of the performance expectations. Next slide, please. So we used to have 25 standards, 13 generic, and 12 specialization standards in school social work. We now have 5 program standards as we're learning, and we also have, so the 5 program standards, standard number 2 is where we house the performance expectations, and I will get into that in a little bit later in my remarks. The other 4 are somewhat similar to some of what we've seen before. Programs have responsibility to establish a program design and rationale that sort of looks at the goals and the mission and the context of the program. Monitoring and assessing candidate progress throughout the program through advisement, supporting academic performance with qualified field instructors and the faculty, a field practicum experience, which I will get into a little bit later, and determining candidate competence through the use of assessment and data gathering. And you're already on the next slide, great. So all MSW programs have both foundation, our full-time programs are 2-year programs, and so some are on semester systems, some are on quarter systems, but each program will look at the foundation, kind of the first year curriculum and field education experience, and their advanced or second year when we're going to be aligning the standards and the performance expectations. One change that we've made is that the field instructor must have an MSW and a PPSC and required to provide a weekly supervision, which is kind of in concert with all MSW programs that require clinical supervision from a qualified field instructor who has 2 years of post-MSW experience. Next slide. A couple of highlights that I want to point out for you in these particular standards is that we moved away from sort of language around candidates have to work with pupils from a different ethnic background from themselves. And while that's still critically important, we broadened the standard to include working with pupils with different LCAP, within different LCAP subgroups or other high need populations, such as to kind of create a much more diverse field education experience, such as working with homeless populations, special education, English language learners, sexual minority youth, and students with mental health needs. I'll finish this slide, and then it looks like we have a question here. The second standard that I wanted to highlight is that we no longer require a certain hour requirement per grade range. So in the past, you had to work with a minimum of 100 hours in 2 different grade ranges. What the standard now says is that you still have to work with at least 2 different grade ranges, but there's no hour minimum requirement. So you could work in a high school for the majority part of your field education experience, but then you might attend a middle school or an elementary school board meeting or a one-day training, or you might work on some child welfare and attendance activities in that particular grade range. And so what we're going to do is we'll allow districts or internships to determine where their need is, and where and when necessary can consult with a university partner to ensure that the performance expectations are still being met across these varying grade ranges. Terry, there's a question?
So the question was, can you clarify university supervision requirements versus site supervision? And let me talk about this generically from the Commission's point of view first, and then you can speak specifically for school social work. The university or program supervision is the supervisor that's actually employed by the Commission-approved program, and they normally know a lot more about the program because they're more integrated into the actual program. Site supervision is what we look at as the district-employed supervisor for teachers. It's the cooperating teacher. And administrators, it's that administrator that's helping guide the candidate along the way. So how does that work in pupil personnel services, school social work, Steve?
Yeah, very similar, Terry. So the university supervisor would be, myself or other colleagues that are employed by the university to sort of govern the overall direction and alignment of standards in a student, in the program. The site supervisor would be the person working actually employed by a school district or perhaps an agency that's contracted with schools that provides the supervision of the MSW student on site while they're in their internship or field education experience.
Excellent. And I'm unmuting Shira now because we want to hear, is this the same in school counseling?
Yes. So we require 1 hour of individual supervision for site supervision. So the site supervisor who's employed by the school site and district, or 1.5 hours of group supervision at the site by the site supervisor. And for university supervision, it's 1.5 hours per week of group supervision that lasts the duration of the field experience.
Thank you much. Now back to Steve.
Okay, and then we can go to the next slide. So one thing that's really exciting about the performance expectations is that we've grounded them in the educational policy and accreditation standards set forth by the Council on Social Work Education, or CSWE. And this is the governing body for all MSW programs nationwide. So essentially, programs that provide MSW education can now easily articulate how to embed the performance expectations in their coursework curricula and in their field education, especially in the field education evaluation instruments. So there's a nice synchronicity, if you will, between what the CSWE or MSW program curriculum requires and what the performance expectations will require for a student to earn the PPSC in school social work. So we're really excited about that major change. And several themes. And so within the performance expectations, similar to what Shira described and I believe Brent described, each performance expectation will have 2 to 3 elements that will describe how the performance expectation will be met by the candidate. And in fact, there's a smaller group of people working statewide to sort of create some examples of how students or candidates can meet some of these performance expectations within each element. The program, when they're writing to these newly adopted standards and performance expectations, for the PEs, they must demonstrate where that performance expectation is introduced, where it's assessed, and then where it's practiced. And that can happen in coursework, and that can also happen in their field education internships. Several new themes have emerged in these new PEs, such as the emphasis on trauma-informed schools and practices within those schools, restorative practices, addressing racial equity, attendance, and addressing and really looking at overall school culture, school communities, and school climates. Next slide. So as we've already been learning more about, the child welfare and attendance hours will now be embedded into a candidate's coursework and field education. So it won't necessarily be a standalone credentialed experience, but rather woven into the candidate's learning as described in a lot of the areas of the performance expectations. When you have a chance to really sink your teeth into them, you'll see we include attendance, truancy, absenteeism throughout many of the different performance expectations. Childhood growth and development has been reinforced and highlighted as its own performance expectation. It actually will be, it's the last one, it's number 10. And we also have now a stronger emphasis on data and data-informed practice and the use of technology to inform decision making. Okay, I don't know if there are other questions, Terry?
Not at this point in time, no. Please, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We're going to move over to Roxanne, and then we'll look for more questions.
All right, good afternoon. So I am going to focus on the PPS regulatory process. So in California, you have laws that are voted on and enacted by the legislature. And for the commission, those laws are housed in what we call the Education Code. And code law is also referred to as statute. So there are specific laws already in place about PPS credentials and about standards in general. So there is a law in place that says that the commission shall develop and adopt standards. It doesn't say what standards, it doesn't say what's encompassed in the standards or how to go about it. It just says that there will be standards. So a state agency then takes those broad statements in the law and they clarify and they make specific and they implement those laws. And so every state agency who has authority over that section of Education Code is required to develop regulations. Ours are housed under what we call Title V, so Title V regulations. And within those Title V regulations, once they're developed and adopted, they have the force of law. And you'll find some of your preconditions are based on those Title V regulations also. And some of them are based on Education Code. So the staff develops the regulations and they go through the commission for approval. And then they are posted as a public document for public comment. And then they may go through a public hearing, they may not. It depends on the comments that come in and other factors. But in any case, once it goes through that public time process and approval by the commission, it moves forward to what we call the Office of Administrative Law. And they make sure that everything in it is clear and legal and aligned with the Education Code law. And once they've done that, they then hopefully approve those regulations, and then those become published and public and part of the regulatory process that will govern your PPS programs. So part of the new regulations will include these new standards, and the standards themselves are what we call incorporated by reference. So there'll be a link to the actual standards and the standards saying that those standards must be met for the PPS credential to be issued. There'll be other things in the standards like the requirements for the credential. And then lastly, there'll be statements in there about the authorization statement that goes on the PPS credential. So once your candidate is recommended for the credential, on that credential there's a statement that says what they're authorized to do with that credential. And those will also be in the Title V regulations. So these regulations, it's anticipated right now that we'll have them ready to move forward and hopefully done with its public process, ready to move forward to the Office of Administrative Law, hopefully in summer 2020, so long before you'll need to be recommending candidates for the new credential. And with that, I'll turn it over to Cheryl to talk about all important transition.
Great. Hi, everybody. So I was going to talk a little bit about the transition timeline. You know, when the Commission adopts new standards or revised standards, they always allow for the opportunity for the institution to go through its internal institutional processes and to really think about the new standards, to develop the coursework or change coursework, change fieldwork, do the things that they need to do internally. And so typically that's a 2-year period. It depends on the standards and the level of changes. But so, you know, the purpose is really of this time period is really to give the institution that opportunity to go through their processes, as well as for the Commission to do what it needs to do, such as what Roxanne was just talking about, for us to go through the regulatory process. So these things have to happen in order for us to be able to enforce the new standards. So this slide talks about the timeline. As you know, the standards were adopted in April of this past year, 2019. Everybody very excited that these finally were passed, much improved over the former ones and updated to reflect our current situation in California. We have given a period of technical assistance, and one of the things we really want to do is make sure that all of you, as you're thinking about these changes and making these improvements to your programs, that you have the experts from the field to lean on, as well as Commission staff. So there's a nice long period of time to provide technical assistance. Karen Sacramento and Roxanne will probably be the two that you'll see quite often from the Commission as they, you know, work with professional associations and organizations to get the word out about these new standards and to answer questions. And obviously today is one of our first forays into this area. So one of the next things that I'm sure you're very interested in is what kind of transition plan or what documentation does the Commission need? And I'll talk a little bit about that. We are soon going to release the template or the forms that we need for the transition plan. We will do that by the end of this month. So by the end of January, we will have that available on our website, and I'll talk a little bit about what's in that. We're currently in the final editing and approval stage, so that will be available very soon. And those will be due a year from now. So January 31st of 2021 is when they will be due, and they will be reviewed by staff as we go through. Ultimately, no new candidates may be enrolled in the current program after July 1 of 2021. So those are the current standards that you've been all operating for a number of years. And then with the academic year of 21-22, all programs should be transitioned fully into the new standards. Hopefully the regulations will be all set and passed, and everybody will be on board as of the academic year beginning in fall of 2021. We know everybody's on a different academic year, and that always makes it a little challenging, but basically that's the timeline. So given that timeline, let's move to the next thing. I want to talk a little bit about the transition document, and I'm going to pull up our draft here. So one of the things we've really tried to do is we try to minimize the onerousness of this process on you. So we want to give faculty and have the focus really be on those important conversations that you're having at your institution and not on providing us with a ton of narrative. In the old days, we used to require all institutions to provide a standard by standard narrative of the revisions. We're not doing that. In fact, if you've gone through program review anytime recently, it's very similar to that. So one of the things we're asking in our transition document that you will see later this month is we're asking you to identify who is your team. Who's your team looking at these new standards and kind of analyzing what you need to change in your program. The second thing we're asking for is your timeline for when you think that you can transition all these various pieces. And then we're asking for things that are hopefully authentic pieces that we're not asking you to create a lot of long narratives for us, but really, what will the course sequence look like? What we will be asking for a course matrix, and we know at this point in time it's a plan. So these important performance expectations that all three of these individuals have been talking about, we want to know where in that course sequence you're going to be introducing that topic. Ultimately, when you're in accreditation, you'll be telling us also where you are the candidate is practicing that and where they will be assessed on those performance expectations. So the process for the transition documentation mirrors the program review documentation. So if you're in that, you should be able to use the same documentation, only updated for either program review that you are for your transition document. What we will do is ask for those to be turned in by January 2021. If you have any questions, of course, you can email the accreditation email box, which is accreditation@ctc.ca.gov, and we'll be happy to respond to those as soon as we can. They will be reviewed by staff. It will help us also identify if any additional technical assistance, if everybody seems to be having some issues. On the standards in the transition documents, we'll be asking you to identify whether parts of the program are an area of major revision, minor revision, or no revision at all, so that we can kind of see where the big issues are with institutions. And it's no reflection on your program. We also, if all of it is major revision, then we want to be able to make sure that you have some folks that you can lean on to help with the technical assistance for those. If some of those are no revision, then we want to make sure you understand that there are significant changes in these standards. So it helps us kind of identify how we talk to each one of you and what kind of support we can provide to each program. Yes, go ahead, Karen.
I just want to add that the transition document, the transition plan document, will be available this month, hopefully at the end of the month, and we will notify the field of that through the PSD e-news, and then we will be also starting a PPS webpage on the commission page, and it will be placed there as well. But that's where you should be looking for it in the next couple of weeks.
Right. So be looking at the PSD e-news. If you haven't subscribed to it, please do on our website. You'll find it on the program sponsors page or tab on the right-hand side. So, okay. And then the implications for accreditation cohorts. This is always a really challenging thing for institutions as well as the commission when we're transitioning from old standards to new standards. So right now, the orange cohort, if you're in orange cohorts, you're getting, your site visit is right now, essentially. And so the site visits that will take place this spring are on the current set of standards. For red cohort, you have turned in your program review documentation already, and your site visit is sometime between fall 2020 and spring 2021. Those will be reviewed by our site visit teams to the current set of standards, because the new set of standards are non-enforceable yet. So we will be doing that. There are two exceptions to that. Two institutions that are helping us sort of pilot or field test the new standards to figure out the accreditation processes and make sure that works for us. The violet cohort is going to be the one that's a little bit challenging because you have 1 foot in the old and 1 foot in the new. When you turn in your program review documentation, you're in the current set of standards, but by the time the team gets to you, you're going to be in the new standards, or the new standards will be fully in effect. So we are allowing the institution to make the decision about whether you want to submit program review to the old or the new. Now, there's going to be some work that we have to do in either case, because what we want to do is make sure that the team understands when they get there what what aspects of the program are fully, if you've made any changes between the fall and between the time that you have your site visit, between program review and site visit. So we will work with you individually as you go through this, but we want to make it as flexible as we possibly can for the Violet cohort, because you are the straddlers between this. And then by the time we get to Indigo, you will be turning in to the new standards, of course, and your site visit will be based on the new standards. So we always have a couple of years of very challenging transitions. There are a lot of aspects to the new standards you can probably incorporate and transition now. It doesn't require, but to be fully in, and some of these languages, for instance, like the higher number of hours that Steve was talking about in social work, that's something that we can't enforce until it's in regulations and that kind of thing. So it's a little challenging. Bear with us and work with us. Let us know if you have any questions about your institution or your programs in particular, and we're happy to work with you on this. Fortunately, we have a little bit of history now with these transitions between the general ed teaching programs, administrative services programs, and now PPS. So we're happy to work with you and to figure out what works best for your institution and for the accreditation system.
So Cheryl, we had a specific question which said, if we want to, can we accept candidates in the new program in fall of 2020? And I think with Roxanne's information about regulations, that actually is not going to necessarily work.
Right.
Accurate. You're quite welcome to start meeting those new standards, start implementing the new content. We think that's very important. But as Roxanne shared about regulations, until the regulations are finalized, we actually can't require what's in the new standards, and we can't give the authorization that goes with the new standards. So really, 2021 is the year that every program needs to transition, and you really can't fully transition in the 2020 year.
Okay. Okay, on the horizon, Roxanne.
Okay, so we actually have an update here. So in the slide, it says that transition timelines will be available starting in February 2020, and our transition documents will be out actually by the end of January 2020. So we're meeting our own deadlines, beating our own deadlines. We already talked about Karen and I coming out and providing technical assistance to CASP, I think, was one of our targeted areas, but also throughout the state to other stakeholders and groups, and then also offered here at the Commission maybe. So we're looking at different opportunities to provide technical assistance, starting off with the one that we have right now. And this particular technical assistance, this orientation, will be posted on our website. We'll as said, we'll conduct regional meetings and focused on the different specialty areas too. We are going to be updating information and sharing them in program sponsor alerts, PSAs, and you'll find that information coming out in the PSD e-news. So keeping a lookout on the PSD e-news, and if you have not signed up for it, Cheryl mentioned that's on our webpage under program sponsors. And with that, we have all questions coming to accreditation@ctc.ca.gov, and it would be targeted to the right person who can answer your question.
We do have one more question that we want to ask Brent, Shira, and Steve to each respond to. So, are there any changes in terms of the site field supervisor requirements, the years of experience, or the specific type of credential or license they need to hold? So I think that when Steve was talking, that was clear, but now they're asking back to school psychology. Could you talk about that quickly, Brent? And then Shira, could you talk about school counseling? Shira, are you ready to go first, and then we'll come back to Brent?
Sure. Okay. Excuse me. For supervisor
school counseling.
Yes, for supervisor qualifications, we did include in what it says now in the newly adopted standards is possession of a PPS school counseling credential and a minimum of 2 years of PPS experience. that is appropriate to their the candidate's fieldwork experience.
And for school psychology, the only change we made is in this sentence, and it's in standard 4 for practica and fieldwork. It says, whether provided by faculty or field-based professionals, practicum supervision must be provided by an experienced, and we added there, minimum 2 years. So you need to have 2 years experience, professional who possesses background, training, and credentials appropriate to the practicum experience. So it may be that you have a university faculty member who does not have a school psychology or a PPS credential, could be a licensed clinical psychologist doing counseling supervision. That would be appropriate to their work setting. But school people certainly would have to have the Pupil Personnel Service school psychology credential, and that 2 years experience applies both to university and field-based supervisors.
It's a lot like the book, if you give a mouse a cookie, they always want something more. So now, for the schools, does the PPS have to have been issued in California? And this would not be for a school practitioner. This would be for a university faculty member. And my belief would be, no, it does not have to be issued in and I'm seeing nodding from Brent here in the building. I'm not seeing anything specific from Steve. Does it, if they hold a PPS in a different state, is that okay?
No, they would have to have that PPSC from California, because I don't know what other states are doing with regards to their, sometimes they're not called credentials, they're called certificates or licenses. So we do require it to be in the state of California.
And Shira, what about you?
I would say similarly to what Steve shared, though there's nothing specifically included, I just checked back to that standard. But there would need to be discussion and understanding of what the state requires to be a school counselor.
It seems to me like we're going to need a little table maybe on this, and that will appear on this new PPS webpage that I've been mentioning and talking about in the chats. We have one more thing that says here, would someone, I think it's going to be Cheryl, would you clarify the timeline that states no new candidates may enroll in the current programs after July 1st of 2021?
Yes, so the intent is that the academic year, and we know everybody's academic year is different, the academic year of 21, beginning in fall of 2021, those candidates should all be, so the newly enrolled candidates should all be in the programs that are aligned to the new standards. You may have, and it's very likely you have, candidates finishing out the old standards. Candidates have catalog rights, and they are allowed to finish out programs that they started. So it is understandable if you have, for at least a couple of years, some candidates finishing out the program and all your new candidates are coming in under the new standards and the new coursework. That will be for the institution to decide how it wants to do that. But we picked the July date because it seemed to be the one that works the best for the various academic years. And Terry, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that anymore.
The intention is that people enrolling for the 21-22 year enroll in the new program. So if you have candidates that start in mid-June of 21, it would be really nice if you could get them into the new program. We think the new program is a better way to prepare educators, so that we would really like that to happen. We've got a couple more specific questions about what license someone needs, and can a California licensed educational psychologist supervise this or supervise that? I think what we want to do is really collect up all those questions and work on a very clear document that delineates for each of these three. So if you could send that question in to either the accreditation email that's on your screen or to either Karen Sacramento or Roxanne Purdue, we will pull this together and try to get a very clear document about the university supervisor and the district employed supervisor. In general, the commission's policies are that if a university has hired a faculty member, They have whatever advanced degree that university requires. We don't require that faculty member usually to have the commission's license to do whatever it is the faculty member is doing. But we will get this very clear and try to get it in writing for you. I'm seeing a good number of thank yous. Oh, Steve, you have a question you can answer. So, Steve, for school social work, please go ahead.
Yeah, so right now the current language in the standard states that the PPSC can, as long as the person is being supervised with someone with an MSW, the PPSC could be in a different discipline. We don't encourage that. We want it to be in social work, but that's what the standard states. Now, keep in mind that it is at the university discretion. So I know that there are some universities that will require that PPSC be in school social work, but the standard does state that it could be in school counseling or school psychology. So it may be up to, so statewide it's open, but it may be up to a specific university if they're going to require that specialized discipline. What I will say is that it does have to be the same person. The old standards state that the person could be supervised by somebody with an MSW, and if it's not that, and if the same person doesn't have a PPSC, then somebody else within the school district would be identified to kind of do split supervision. We eliminated that. So it does have to be the same person, but technically it could be from a different discipline. I just wanted to clarify that.
All right. Thank you very much for being a part of our webinar. Thank you to our experts from the work groups, and we do welcome any questions you may continue to have as you think about the presentation today. Again, that accreditation at ctc.ca.gov, and they will then be forwarded on to Roxanne and myself. And we look forward to working and providing technical assistance to PPS programs throughout the next year and a half. So thank you again, and this ends our webinar for today.